A Father's Promise by Donnalynn Hess, Chapter 21. A Narrow Escape. He sent from above, he took me, he drew me out of many waters, he delivered me from my strong enemy, and from them which hated me, for they were too strong for me. Psalms 18, 16, and 17. Rudy stopped and looked about him. A heavy snow was beginning to fall, and the morning seemed especially gray. The cold of the previous night had forced him and Ingrid to seek the shelter of a barn. Now they were heading back to the forest. Rudy glanced down at Ingrid, who was shivering almost uncontrollably. Should he risk stopping to build a fire, or should he wait until they reached a safer place? As he stood there thinking, he listened to the trees creak and groan under the weight of the ice that had formed on their limbs. It was definitely cold. He stopped. It was difficult getting a fire started under such conditions, but over the past weeks, Rudy had become a master at building fires. Before long, he managed to create a tiny flame which he fed and nurtured until the small clearing was ablaze with light and warmth. He sat Ingrid on his lap and drew himself as close to the fire as he dared. Ingrid soon stopped her shivering and grew drowsy. Resting her head against his shoulder, she fell asleep. We should get moving again, Rudy reasoned to himself, but Ingrid's contentment and the warm tingling sensation in her hands and feet discouraged him from obeying his reason, and he yielded to his desire to stay by the fire. Within the hour, however, he regretted his decision, for in the distance he heard dogs barking. Though the sound was still very faint, it was clear enough to rouse his fears and force him into immediate action. "Come on, Ingrid," he said, standing her on her feet. "Help me get some snow on this fire." She was still in a sleepy stupor, but she obeyed his as best as she could. His mind raced as he threw leaves and branches about the clearing they had made. "We must cover our tracks carefully," he thought. "You've already made one mistake. You can't afford another. I know I can outwit the soldiers, but the dogs? How can I fool the dogs?" "That's enough," he said, turning to Ingrid. He then knelt down so that he could look directly at her. "You've got to listen carefully," he told her. "We may be in a little trouble, but if you do exactly as I say, things will be all right. Do you understand?" She nodded. "Good. Now climb up on my back and hang on," he instructed her. He moved quickly, backtracking periodically in an effort to make his trail confusing, but he soon realized that backtracking was costing him valuable time. The Germans and their dogs were gaining on them. Giving up the idea of disguising his trail, he headed straight for the nearest river. He knew it was frozen, but he had an idea. Once he had reached its bank, he traveled in until the river narrowed to a width of about 8 feet. The ice was fairly new, formed during the previous day, and night's hard freeze and not yet covered by snow. "Hang on as tight as you can," he said to Ingrid as soon as he had stopped. "I've got to use my hands, but I don't want to let you get down." She clung to him so tightly that she nearly choked him, but he did not complain. He knew that it was better to bear the strain of Ingrid's weight than to let her down and risk having the dogs pick up her scent. The fact that they could pick up his was bad enough. Scanning the area, he found two good-sized branches, dragged them over to the river's edge, and eventually managed to form a bridge across the river. He stood a few seconds to catch his breath. "I'm going to take you over to the other side," he then said, "but we're going to have to be as still as possible. If I lose my balance, we'll both end up falling through the ice." He shifted her weight to the most comfortable position and then stepped on out onto the logs. His legs trembled. As he stood trying to steady himself, he heard the dogs again. Their sound convinced him that they had caught the scent and were now on his trail. Starting out, he slid his right foot forward too far and began to topple. Quickly, he drew his left foot up parallel to his right and waited until he was again steady. Then he moved his right foot forward, this time only slightly. Thus, inch by inch, he made his way across the logs. "All right, Ingrid," he said, jumping onto the opposite side. "Hang on tight again. I've got to get up that tree." It took all the strength he had to hoist them both into the tree, but spurred on by fear, he managed to continue climbing. "Now you sit here, and I'll be back," he said, as he settled her on the high branch. There was a look of terror in her eyes as he began to descend his descent. "Don't look down," he said. "Just sit still. I'll be back in a minute." He was sliding down from limb to limb so fast that his hands and face were getting terribly scratched from the bark. But he had no time to worry about such things. As soon as he reached the ground, he ran back to the riverbank and began recrossing the bridge. This time he crawled on his hands and knees, enabling him to make it less than half the time. Once on the other side, he took up a heavy stick. He intended to use it to break through the ice and make his pursuers think that he had fallen through. Lifting the heavy stick over his head, he brought it down with all his might onto the ice. It cracked. Again he raised it and struck a blow. He had broken through, but as he looked at his work, he knew that it was not good enough. The cracks had extended from the hole were not long enough or numerous enough. In order to convince them, he had to actually use his weight to break through. By this time, Rudy could hear that the dogs were in a frenzy. He knew they were close. So did he. Quickly he sat down and removed his boots and socks. He then took off his shirt and coat, tying everything in his coat. He tossed the bundle over to the other side of the bank. He then stepped out onto the ice. It held firm. He squatted down, then jumped up and came down with a crash. The icy water that covered him was so cold that he was momentarily paralyzed. He felt as if he were drowning. Then his feet found a bottom of the river, and he stood. His head was above the water. "Move! Get out, you idiot!" he yelled at himself. But the cold reached out and seemed to hold each joint and muscle in a vice-like grip. To move was agony. "Help me, Lord," he prayed, and he soon found enough strength to grab hold of one of the logs and pull himself out of the water and onto his makeshift bridge. He lay balanced across the logs, panting until he began to hear not only dogs but also voices. He struggled to his hands and knees and recrossed the river. As soon as he reached the bank, he slid on his boots, put on his coat, and hurriedly stuffed the rest of his clothing down into his coat. Then, standing near the hole, he lifted the first log by its end. Carefully walking atop the second, he half dragged, half carried the first one into the brush. From the riverbank, he hauled up the second log and dragged it away. A fallen branch, covered with leaves and snow, lay across the thicket. He pulled it out and used it to try to cover the tracks made by the logs and his feet on the snowy riverbank. Summoning his last vestige of strength, he made it up the tree. Snow plopped off its branches and fell below, covering up more of the tracks. A trained woodsman like Oscar would have read the clumps of fallen snow as a sure sign that someone was up in the tree. But Rudy guessed that the soldiers were not that experienced. "Here, over here," Rudy heard one of the soldiers shout. "Looks like whoever it was fell through." The dogs quieted once they reached the river, for the scent had stopped at the hole in the ice. "How deep's the river?" Rudy heard the second soldier ask. "I don't know," the first one said, "but I'm sure it's deep enough to drown a man." "Maybe," said the other. The uncertainty on the soldier's voice made Rudy anxious, for already his trousers were stiff and frozen, and his hands and feet had almost lost all sense of feeling. He had to get to a fire soon, or he would freeze to death. Even if it wasn't all that deep, the first soldier reasoned. If anyone fell through, he'd drown. The cold would freeze him stiff before he could ever work up enough strength to pull himself out. Rudy heard rustling, and moments later the second soldier said, "Here, shove the stick down there and see how deep it is." Rudy heard a splash. "At least 5 feet," the first answered. "Once someone fell in, I assure you he wouldn't be able to get out." Then after a prolonged silence he added, "Besides, even if he did, he'd freeze to death out here. Once he'd gotten wet, come on, otherwise we'll be frozen too." "I suppose you're right," the second soldier finally agreed. "I'm getting hungry. Let's get going." The first man seemed enthusiastic about that. "Good idea. There will be plenty of time after lunch to chase resistance fighters and runaway Jews." "Thank you, Lord," Rudy murmured as he listened to the soldiers' laughter fade away. Then as he and Ingrid climbed down from their hiding place, he prayed, "Now just keep them away long enough for me to get a fire along. That will dry my trousers and get the blood moving in my veins again." By this time, Rudy wondered if he would even be able to build a fire. As he began gathering kindling, he realized that there was no feeling left in his hands. Though he could see himself pick up the twigs, he could not feel his hands clutching them. "Here, Ingrid," he said, Hold on to these twigs for me for a couple of seconds." He vigorously beat his hands against his thighs in an effort to get his circulation going again. It worked, and as soon as he began to feel a prickling sensation in his fingers, Ingrid seemed a bit frightened by his strange behavior. "It's all right, Ingrid," he assured her. "I'm just so cold I can hardly hold on to anything, so we've got to work fast." He was finally able to complete the foundation for the fire. Then came the most difficult part, lighting the match. He had never felt so clumsy. After again slapping his hands against his thighs for a few moments, he drew a match out of his pocket and tried to strike it. It took several times before he was successful, but at least the fire blazed. He built the fire close to the trunk of an enormous tree that had fallen. It reflected the heat a little bit, making a nice warm space between itself and the flames. He sat on top of the trunk, hands stretched out, wet trousers as close to the flames as he could get without singeing them. He glanced at Ingrid. "You're going to have to stay here about an hour until I'm good and thawed out." Reluctantly, she came and sat down beside him. "It'll be all right. They've gone," he said. "And God will keep them away," he added emphatically. His words seemed to satisfy her and at the same time to increase his own faith in God's protection. But even though his faith was strong, his spirit was heavy. Rudy was tired. Tired of running, tired of the cold, tired of the bleak winter forest.